episode, is it 214? 213? I think it's 213 now. It might be 214. I don't know. It's one of them. And I was just telling Roger about a guest tomorrow that the rest of you are just going to have to wait and find out. Who, I don't know how I'm going to top that guest. I might just have to end the podcast. But Roger Williams, back in the saddle. Thank you for your patience last week. I had to delay because I was redlining it so hard with work, schoolwork, and 3 episodes a day. I almost collapsed.
Problem, it's your gig, man. It's like I understand, been there myself.
Yeah.
So and now with actual decent audio and video.
I know.
Thanks to the fact that my dad asked me to watch a TV show. He said I might get into this show next that just premiered on Fox.
Okay.
About an AI that's going out of control, running around the internet, killing people and shit.
Naturally.
It's right in my wheelhouse.
Naturally.
But I had missed the premiere. So I went to Fox's website to see if I could watch it online. And on this computer I used to use this computer as a media server for my actual television set.
Okay.
But the last time I did that was maybe a year ago.
Okay.
And this thing would play 8 seconds and buffer 4. 8 seconds, 4. 8 seconds, 4. 8 seconds, 4. Wouldn't settle down. Nothing I could do on that player would stop it. And I just gave up.
Yeah.
Threw my hands in the air. Well, the other thing Dad did last week was he asked me to get him a computer.
Okay.
Because he said I kept sending him these long podcast links, and he's gotten to the point where it's a little difficult for him to sit at the desk where his desktop computer is mounted for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So he asked if I could get him a laptop so he could sit in his recliner and do his email and watch my shows with you and stuff like that. So
Sure.
I said, sure, I'll pick you up in the computer. You can pay me back for it. And I was supposed to take it to him last Saturday. Because some of our relatives were also coming up from Florida. We're going to have a family get-together. Well, Hurricane Delta killed that.
Okay.
So I'm trying to watch this episode of this TV show on his computer that has always worked in the past. And I'm looking at this brand new Lenovo laptop over here. And I'm asking, I wonder. So, fuck it. I'm going to try this. So I set Dad's computer up, went to the thing, and it played the whole episode at 720p smooth as butter. So it was not my internet connection. It was the computer. All I can figure is Windows Update must have choked the thing at some point over the years. So this is my dad's computer that I'm using now, but mine is in the box on the floor. I just picked it up today.
Okay.
Exact same model. So next week I will be in the saddle with a computer that does all my stuff.
Perfect.
And, yeah, we will not have that problem in the future.
The evolution of this podcast is going to be brilliant over the coming years. It's just going to be you and me doing episodes again and again, and it's slowly as it gets up to like 8K, 240 FPS, multiple cameras. It's going to have like stereoscopic views. I'll bring in smells so they can smell how shitty I am.
And you're going to have the President of the United States as the guest in your next show.
Apparently, man. Apparently, dude. That's not to spoil tomorrow's, but apparently I had my friend on today, who I can't even say who he worked for, but he's been on this podcast before. But he goes, dude. He goes, well, Tommy. He goes, this is very exciting. And he goes, Rogan's never had on anyone like that. But he goes, how are you going to top it? And it dawned on me that I had no idea.
Well, the way you look at that is how you've had several guests already that you were wondering how you would top.
Sure.
And the way you do it is you keep emailing people and ask if they'll be on your show. And somehow some of them keep saying yes.
Somehow, dude, I was talking to my friend today, another guy, Warren, who's been on here several times. And Warren goes, to me, this is just proof that there's no God. And I was like, why? And he goes, the fact that you're just pulling this off, that you're just sending out emails and it's working. He goes, that just shows that there's no righteousness in this world. And I was just like, I agree with that. It's proof that God is dead. I was like, it's not that but it's but I was like that. I go, yeah, something's not right that I can just open a laptop and start yelling into it for an hour every day. And 10 months later.
Well, so anyway, I was going to show you a few things on the show on Woo and didn't get a chance.
Oh, yeah.
So I still have them here. This is the computer that I bought for the Yi King.
Okay.
And this was a Radio Shack pocket computer. The actual thing here was made by Sharp and rebranded for Radio Shack.
Okay.
That's the computer. And the printer was important because I was using this to print the hexagrams. I would sit here, toss the coins, go HHT, toss the coins, TTT, done. Do that 6 times, done. And the computer would figure out and print the hexagram or the 2 hexagrams and cross-reference to the King Wen book so I could look it up easily. And that's the only thing that this machine was ever used for. This thing has a whopping, wait for it, 2 kilobytes of RAM.
My God. That should be classified, son.
It took someone of my considerable skill in this matter to cram that program into this thing.
Jesus Christ in heaven. Well, I mean, Bill Gates said no one will ever need more than 680 kilobytes, so...
Yeah. Anyway, and also, here's some tarot cards.
Oh, yeah.
This was my card. I mentioned having a card that it would come out that I knew that meant me. That's Valraven,
okay.
the King of Wands. And you can tell the resemblance. He even has a bird. It was just the way that the readings came out. I eventually realized that Valraven was me when it showed up in a reading. This is the 9 of Pentacles. It's an example of a minor arcana face card.
Okay.
And you can see that shows the pregnant woman in the bliss of her fecundity, getting ready to do some creation.
Almost some Virgin Mary vibes.
Yeah. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Queen of Swords.
Okay.
Don't want to meet her in a dark alley.
No. not in any alley ever, regardless of light conditions.
While we're on the Queens, here's the Queen of Cups.
Okay.
It's a water sign, so you have your kind of ice goddess there.
Okay.
And the last one, the Queen of Pentacles, is an ancient goddess of fecundity and creation. And actually, the pentacles are associated with money, wealth, and stuff like that.
Okay.
But those are the 4 suits instead of clubs, diamonds, and spades and so forth. In the major arcana, this is the 0 card I told you about, the Fool. And you can see this fellow's about to fall off that cliff if he's not careful. But he's about to start a 21 card journey, or 22 card journey, counting that one. And this is where it ends at the World.
Okay.
And that is where you get everything that you long, wish for, and need.
So it's like the ultimate boon in Joseph Campbell? Yeah.
Of course, it also depends on where the card appears. This is the Barbara Walker Tarot deck. She was a feminist, basically academic, and she did not believe there was anything supernatural about this stuff at all. A lot of people in the day thought of the divination devices as ways to connect with your subconscious intuition and things like that. And drawing tarot decks was a popular pastime for artists in the 80s. But that was the deck that we used to do most of our experiments. And I just figured I would show you a little quick tour of some
Thank
of the
you, man.
cards
They're
there.
badass. Yeah, no, it's always good to have a little... Oh, yeah, because that was... We didn't do an episode last week. Yeah, that was...
Yeah, that was the one where we had no
audio. Video. That was our Apollo 13 episode. Where,
So I didn't have a lot to show you there, but I did have that.
Thank you.
So I figured I would bring that up.
Thank you.
So I've told you the saga of the computer, which picked it up on the way home from work today. This is mine.
Brand new Lenovo.
I delete all my stuff off of Dad's. So anyway, we were going to talk about Moore's Law, the exponential increase in computer capability. But I wanted to start off talking about something else that increased exponentially, so I can draw a comparison.
Absolutely.
Remember, I like to tell you about how I like to draw these broad cases of similarity between things that seem unrelated at first.
Yeah.
And so what I want to talk about first is engines.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right.
Because that's something that people who are afraid of computers and don't understand them can understand engines.
Okay.
So that's something we can see. The progressive engine design started in 1712 when the Newcomen steam engine was invented. So engines are about as old as porn in the way I reckon.
I was about to say, but yeah, French pamphlets. Okay.
So, Yeah, just different part of Europe. And the Newcomen steam engine was what they call an atmospheric engine. It was very inefficient, very slow, and it revolutionized mining and agriculture because it made it possible to use fire instead of labor to lift water. And that was the main thing it was used for 50 or 60 years. And then this guy, James Watt, came along in the late 17th century. It's a little unclear where you would want to date the origin of the Watt engine because he had a lot of trouble getting it developed and getting it accepted. But he realized that the way the Newcomen engine worked is you would put steam in the cylinder, not high pressure steam, just like the steam you get off of vaporizing off your stove, basically. But it would generate just enough force to lift the cylinder and reset the mechanism. And then you would spray cold water into the cylinder to make the steam condense. And it was actually atmospheric pressure that generated the power stroke as the cylinder is pushed back down.
Okay.
And so what James Watt realized is that this was very wasteful because you were having to heat the cylinder up and then cool the cylinder down along with the steam. And so you were using a lot of fire to do that, a lot of coal. So he had the idea of using a separate condenser. And this made his engine 3 or 4 times more efficient. So that's 3 or 4 times less coal that you have to burn to move the same amount of water. And so it was a huge advance. But what most people don't know is that Watt's engine was still an atmospheric engine. It was still a fairly low power, not very fast engine. It was just a lot more efficient than the Newcomen engine. Mm-hmm. And because of Watt's patents, no one else could work on an engine that used high-pressure steam. Watt didn't want to work with high-pressure steam because he thought it was dangerous, because it is. And he didn't think that was a good idea. But anyone who did couldn't use a separate condenser because of Watt's patent. So they had to wait for that to run out. And so it was the beginning of the 19th century before you started to see more rapid progress in the design of steam engines. And the entire 19th century is an accelerating curve in the progress of reciprocating steam engines. They get more powerful, they get more efficient, they get faster, they get larger, and they start showing up all over the place. So this is very similar to what happened with computers. If you look at it, these you can plot these numbers and get a very similar curve to the one they have in the Moore's law. Mm-hmm. Thing in Wikipedia, until the beginning of the 20th century. And right around 1900, 3 things happened that made the whole world was powered by reciprocating steam engines, and then 10 years later, the only thing that was locomotives. Mm-hmm. One was steam turbines. For very high power projects, a steam turbine was more efficient and had fewer moving parts, was easier to service, was just all around better. So for high powered things like power generation, ships, things like that, everything went to turbines. Okay. Now, that's another steam technology. It's another motor. It's another type of engine. So it's not like we've departed from the story of engines here. It's a different kind of engine. Mm-hmm. And that's necessary because steam engines had kind of reached a peak of their development. You were getting to the point where making them any bigger, making them any more efficient was almost impossible because they had perfected what could be done with the material science and the thermodynamics that are involved. The second thing that happened, of course, was the internal combustion engine, which was for small things, portable things, was just much easier to use. It was safer because you didn't have a boiler. And so that took over in almost every application under 100 horsepower, mm-hmm. which at the time, 10 horsepower was a powerful engine. And then, of course, it made the automobile possible, and it made World War I and II look the way that they did because it made tanks and other automated mobile tools of war possible. Yeah. And then the third thing that happened is electricity. And this made it possible to completely rearrange the way that manufacturing plants were done. Because before electricity, if you were building a manufacturing plant, you had an engine at one end of it, which in the 1900s would have been a reciprocating steam engine, but in the starting in the 20th century was much more likely to be internal combustion. Mm-hmm. And it would be connected to a shaft that ran the length of the building on the ceiling. And if you wanted to put a machine like a lathe or a drill press or something anywhere in that building, you had to connect it to the shaft in the ceiling with a belt to power it.
Okay.
That's the way it was done. And this had been raised to a high art during the 19th century. That was another thing, was the way that manufacturing, you could still go into a lot of these old buildings and see the bearings where the shaft used to be all along the length of the ceiling. But with electricity, you could use many smaller motors and just put them wherever you wanted them. So you could just put that drill press in some place where it made more sense for the flow of material and the other ergonomics of manufacturing. And so that completely changed the way that manufacturing plants looked, more than anything else.
I never knew that. That's like a center. That's like a power strip. It's like a charging station at an airport, right? You'll plug in your laptop.
Yeah, so those were three phase changes that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. And then those technologies started on the same curve of being continuously improved during the 20th century. The steam turbines got bigger and more efficient. They had existed before. Nikola Tesla even invented one, but they just couldn't compete until around the turn of the century. The internal combustion engine, of course, we all know what happened with that, because the automotive industry and other industries that used internal, the diesel engines became the engines for things like plants and ships for a while. And we know how many improvements were made there. The compression ratios went up, the lubrication got better, the fuel got better. Of course, you had to use refined fuel for an IC engine, but you're not constantly heating and cooling down the cylinder. There's much better thermodynamics with everything. So, and you don't have this boiler waiting to explode. And then, of course, and of course, the airplane was invented.
Yeah.
So internal combustion dominated the aircraft industry in the mid-war years, between World Wars I and II. Then World War II occurs, and what do you get? The jet engine, invented by
Messerschmitt?
Nazis.
Messerschmitt? Oh. The Messerschmitt 262. The
jet
Nazis.
engine, invented by the Nazis.
Yeah, I knew the Nazis. I thought you were asking the actual name of the guy.
Practical rocket engines, invented by the Nazis.
Those Nazis.
And nuclear power, which the Nazis tried to invent, but we beat them to it. Yes.
Right? Chicago Pile, right?
Well, and of course the atomic bomb, and afterward the peaceful atom, because let's face it, we spent $2 billion in 1945 money to flatten two cities. They kind of had to try and show more than that from it. So there was a big push in that direction, and nuclear energy is kind of a side story here, because I'm talking about engines. And nuclear energy never really contributed much to engines. So that was a phase change that occurred to a certain extent for power generation, which is related. But they tried building a nuclear aircraft jet engine. It didn't work out so well. They decided the most effective way to use it to kill people would be to fly it back and forth across the landscape and let the pollution do the job.
Yeah, Project Pluto.
But anyway, so engines after that were dominated by really there were not a lot of bigger and better engines on the ground. Engines improvements after that were dominated by aircraft and space travel, and you got ever larger, better, more reliable jet engines and ever larger rocket engines, culminating in the F1 rocket engine that powered the Saturn V for the moon race, which had a one F1 engine. Horsepower is a bit tricky for rocket engines because of the way they work. But if you look at the thermal output and what a similar thermal output would mean for a rotary engine, each F1 generated about 30 million horsepower or something like that. And
I always knew the thrust. I never knew the horsepower.
Yeah. It's utterly ridiculous. I mean, you got to remember how much fuel they burned in like a minute and a half. And the thing is that to this day, the F1 is the most powerful engine that has ever been manufactured by human beings.
Yep.
Now, think about that. This is a thing where things have been increasing exponentially since the 1700s. And the last big size improvement was 50 years ago.
Okay.
Since then, there have been no real bigger engines in any of those categories. The largest engine in all those categories, or something within a factor of 2 of what exists now, already existed in 1970. The largest diesel engines have been around 100,000 horsepower. The largest rocket engines have been smaller. Now, the idea with the space shuttle engine was to make it more efficient. It was considered the most efficient rocket engine ever designed, which is a little more important for going into orbit.
Sure.
Until we found out the Russians had beat us in the 60s.
The Buran.
And we never even knew it.
Yeah.
They had figured out how to reuse the fuel that was normally wasted powering the turbo pumps and make it contribute to the thrust, which all of our engines had wasted. And we didn't find that out until after the fall of the Soviet Union, and a bunch of engines that the Kremlin had ordered to be destroyed had actually been kept in a warehouse. And the keepers were like, you guys would be real interested in these. That's another story.
That's the Buran, right? That was the Soviet one, the Buran.
That's the story, the Buran engine.
Energia.
So
that's an episode.
Anyway,
that's an episode.
Yeah. So anyway, so let's look at this though. Okay, we have this exponential increase that went on for nearly 200 years, 250 years, and then it stopped. So why did it stop? And what was the result of that? Well, one of the reasons it stopped was that in all of those categories, we didn't really need a bigger engine badly enough to justify the expense of going through the R&D. Really, the only reason the F-1 ever existed was the Apollo program and the moon race, and that was very exceptional. So you reach a point where there might be a possible improvement. There might be another shoe that could have dropped. Well, we tried nuclear engines for the airplane, and that didn't work. So it won't be until we find some really good reason that we need a 300 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower diesel engine that someone will go to the trouble to build one. Because right now, if you need that much power, you just gang 3 of the smaller ones together, and that's good enough.
Yeah.
So that brings us to computers. Now, of course, in the 40s and 50s, computers were these awkward, weird things that took up a whole room and required a government or some entity like that to build one. And then in the 50s, transistors were invented, and that instantly changed computers, as we talked about before. But in the middle of all that, Gordon Moore, whose name we are about to associate, founded Fairchild Semiconductor in 1958 to make transistors. And they invented the planar process for making transistors, which was much more efficient and easy and reliable than the processes that were in use. They actually forced a couple of very large investment competitors to close manufacturing facilities they had just bought because Fairchild's process was so much of an improvement that they couldn't compete.
Just dead on arrival.
Right, yeah.
Fuck.
So anyway, one of the offshoots of Fairchild's process is that in 1960, they made a single silicon chip with 4 transistors on it. That was the first modern monolithic integrated circuit. There was another kind that a guy named Jack Kirby made in 1959, but we don't use them anymore because all of our ICs are monolithic now. You start with a slab of silicon, and you deposit things on it with dopants and masking and vacuum deposition and stuff. So it was in 1965 that Gordon Moore, who founded Fairchild and was the head of this company that dominated the semiconductor industry at the time, said that the number of components on an integrated circuit is roughly doubling every year. And that was the first statement of Moore's law.
Okay.
Now, in the late 60s, I think it was 68, he left and co-founded Intel because he wasn't happy with the direction Fairchild was taking. And of course, they went, they're still around.
Yeah.
And it was in 75 that he restated his law and said it was more like 2 years. Yeah. But he was still talking about the density of components on a single wafer. If you think about it, if you had 4 transistors in 1960, in 1965, that would have been 5 doublings on his original formula. It's a factor of 32. 32 times 4 is about 100, 120. And that would have been what in the late 60s, early 70s was called medium scale integration.
Okay.
And that's about where things were at the high end in 1965. By the mid 70s, you were putting several thousand transistors on a chip, and that was making things like dynamic and static RAM chips and microprocessors, like the 4004 and the 8008 and so on. But he was seeing it was a different process. The CMOS process was invented then, which is the one we still use today. It's the same electrochemistry, the same dopants. There have been improvements in a lot of the incremental stuff over the years, but the basic process of using masks and optical techniques to expose etchant and use that to control the deposition of new layers has basically been the same since 1970 or so. Now, a modern chip, the one that's probably running both of these computers that we're using, can have 1 billion transistors, and it may take 20 or 30 of those layers to fabricate it. It typically, when they introduce a new process today, it typically means building $1 billion plant.
Okay. And
you can't really refit a plant that was built for your old 14 nanometer process for a 7 nanometer process. It really means building a new plant.
Why is that?
It's just because the whole layout of the thing is based on the number of layers and the types of optical techniques that have to be used. It just affects all of the steps in so many ways that it's easier to build a new building than it is to refit an old one.
Okay, all right.
So ever since 75, Moore's law has been stated by different people in a couple of different ways. One of the things that they talk about is clock speed. And one of the reasons is that clock speed is related to the size of the elements on the chip, which of course is related to how many elements you can put on the chip. So if you plot clock speed and you plot number of elements on a chip, the two curves look pretty similar because until 2000 or so, they were very closely related anyway. And what put the brakes on clock speed in the mid 2000 aughts was heat. Now, an integrated
Prime Intellect.
The Prime Intellect was built in 1988, and it would have been built with probably about 160 nanometer process. Now, to give an idea what that means, the parallax propeller, which I've used for a lot of my hobby projects, is built with a 360 nanometer process. Just because you have built a new plant doesn't mean the old one goes away, because all of these secondary concerns come in that need fabrication, and you can use that old fab. You can say, we have a fab that can do 45 nanometer fabrication, and you just ship them the masks, and they fab the chips for you, and that keeps the plant in business, but it's no longer making the cutting edge product.
Yes.
So they had a relatively old process used to make the propeller chip, and they also couldn't put flash memory on it because they didn't want to use too many layers. They wanted it to be simple and robust. But because it uses such a large process, it's extremely efficient because the insulators are wide and they don't leak. So an integrated circuit, a CMOS IC, dissipates heat for two reasons. One is that an element switches. When an element changes state, there's a brief flow of current, which generates some heat. And the other is leakage. As the insulators get smaller, they leak, and they leak more, to the point where in a modern state-of-the-art chip, 30% to half of the power may be being dissipated by leakage currents in the insulator. So you basically have a computer built on a toaster oven. It's like even if you stop the chip clock and it's not doing any computation at all, it'll still dissipate 20 watts just because of leakage through the insulators that are made. But you have to do that to pack that billion transistors onto a chip this size.
Yeah.
So you start to see leakage when you drop down to 160 nanometers, and we got a lesson in that from Parallax because their successor chip to the propeller, the P2, is on a 160 nanometer process, and they flat out told everybody all those battery projects that'll go for months on a battery because you stopped the clock and woke the chip up periodically. That's not going to happen anymore. It's going to use too much power to power it for months on a battery, and it gets worse. Their engineer told us that we could theoretically do a 45 nanometer P2. It would run at a gigahertz and it would dissipate 20 watts. And everybody was like, build one. And they were like, not until someone pays us a couple $100,000 to do the fab work.
Yeah.
But anyway, when you start talking about 14 nanometer and 7 nanometer, then all of these things are approaching a critical problem, which is you're going to melt the damn chip.
Mm-hmm.
So the practical limit of clock speed for a CMOS integrated circuit with normal cooling, with basic air cooling, is about 2 gigahertz. If you want faster performance, you can get it, but you're using more and more power to get incrementally less and less extra performance. So you may spend 2 or 3 times the power to get a 50% improvement in clock speed.
Okay.
So and this is why you get people who cool their computers with liquid nitrogen and manage to get them up to 4 gigahertz, but that's because they've got the chip buried in liquid nitrogen and all that.
And then all that money to go to liquid nitrogen. Yeah,
and so you're burning, instead of burning 30 or 40 watts to get 2 gigahertz, you're burning 200 watts to get 4 gigahertz.
So it's the same. Okay.
And the thing is, that is worth it for certain problems. The big trend in modern computers has been to go to parallel processing. So instead of trying to make the chips faster, physics has made faster chips impractical for normal users since before 2010. So what they've gone to is dual core, quad core, GPUs with 100 cores. And for certain kinds of problem, that's just as good as having more clock speed.
Okay.
But then for other kinds of problems, it's not, because there are problems that can't be broken up into chunks for parallel processing. They've got to be done serially. And that's where you find people doing these really fancy cooling things and stuff to try and get more performance. But that's a brick wall. That's been hit. Okay. Now, there is still a little performance that can be had getting smaller components, better yields. Like I said, I think Intel is working on a 7 nanometer process now. And to do things, you've got to play all kinds of tricks. They had to move to ultraviolet light to expose the masks. And you've got to make sure that this ultraviolet light you can't see is perfectly focused on a plane that has got to be like within 1 or 2 nanometers of being flat. The practical engineering challenges of building modern integrated circuits are mind blowing. I watched a documentary, and I know you've probably seen the Curiosity rover landing animation, the 19 minutes of terror, and the steps involved with making a modern PC microprocessor make that look like something you would just do every day.
Jesus Christ.
Totally normal thing to do.
Jesus
Christ. And when I watched that movie, I was like, when the sky crane came out, I was just like, all right, now you're just pulling my leg.
Yeah, I know. Dude, that's how I felt with Rob Manning. I was like, part of me was like,
just showing off.
I was like, in his book about the Curiosity, it's like, and then once it does that, and then like a pole comes up and a camera comes out and it shoots a laser at 100 million pulses a second, 30 feet, and I'm like, now you're just lying to me. We didn't go to the moon. Earth is flat. Get off my pot. But no, but that's what they do, and it's okay.
That's how you will feel though if you watch a documentary about how integrated circuits are made, because they may do 20 or 30 of these layers, and everything has to be so accurate that the tiniest little flaw will ruin the chip. And that they make this shit work at all is just unbelievable.
It's fucking magic.
So that's where we are with silicon integrated circuits. And the hard stop we're going to face with component size is that we're getting close to the point where that trace that we make, that line, that metal conductor is starting to act more like a line of atoms than a metal conductor.
Oh, Jesus.
So the components are starting to act less like bulk matter than like a bunch of atoms hanging around together.
Oh, Jesus.
So that's going to be a hard limit on component density.
Right.
And we're going to probably hit that within 5 or 10 years.
Okay.
It's 10 at the outside.
Okay.
And so if we're still on silicon, that's the end of Moore's law. Okay. Now, just as with engines, there are a couple of the only way to avoid those two things is to move off of silicon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the late 80s, it was thought that gallium arsenide would be a good alternative because its electronic properties mean that it can switch 3 or 4 times faster than silicon can, everything else being equivalent. And Cray actually planned to come out with one of the Cray supercomputers using gallium arsenide chips. But
question?
Yes.
I was actually watching a documentary last night. That was one of the promises of SDI. It was how they were going to get SDI to work, was gallium arsenide.
Yeah, because the silicon chips were not fast enough in the day.
Yeah, okay.
So what happened with that, though, is it just turned out that the shit is extremely difficult to work with. The wafers break if you look at them sideways. They're more vulnerable to heat than silicon is. So it's harder to cool them. And Cray was just never able to make a supercomputer work reliably enough to bring it to market. And the whole thing just sort of quietly went away because they improved the silicon processes so much that they started to realize they would never be able to do with gallium arsenide the miniaturization they were doing with silicon, and it was just going to be a waste of time. They couldn't make it go. So, as you have heard me say, though, on our previous shows, the next thing on the periodic table that has everybody salivating is carbon. Everything about carbon makes it look like a magnificent candidate for a semiconductor.
Okay.
It conducts heat better than anything else, so it's easier to cool. It withstands high temperatures better than anything else, so you don't have to cool it as vigorously. And its electronic properties mean it can switch as much as 100 times faster than silicon, which we know because we have made diamond transistors. We've made them out of actual planar process, start with a diamond, make it flat, deposit shit on it, like those early Fairchild silicon transistors. And these things can switch at a terahertz.
Jesus Christ.
So, yeah. And so we know that works. We've also made transistors out of carbon nanotubes and graphene, which are a couple of other, and those are just as promising for the other properties carbon has as bulk silicon. But the problem we have with all of it is fabrication. Mm-hmm. The basic problem with making a planar integrated circuit out of carbon is that semiconductor wafer would have to be made out of diamond. And a pure diamond this size would really piss off the De Beers Corporation.
Yeah, that's how you get some mercenaries coming at you.
And plus, you have to make it. Once you figure out how to make a diamond that size, you also have to figure out how to introduce the dopants that make it NRP positively or negatively charged, so that you can make a semiconductor out of it. I'm pretty sure they've done vapor deposition because it's like I say, they've made a carbon transistor in the lab, but making an integrated circuit requires a substrate. And the hard thing about diamond semiconductors is getting a large enough substrate to do anything interesting. Okay. The problem with nanotubes and graphene is fabricating them at all. All of our methods for fabricating these carbon structures basically involve spraying them onto some kind of substrate. The way that they do nanotube transistors is they literally spray a bunch of nanotubes onto a substrate. It has to be an insulator. And then they go looking for them with a scanning tunneling microscope.
Yeah, which ones?
And when they find one, they hook it up.
Jesus Christ.
So this is not a practical manufacturing technique. I mean,
it is. Yeah.
It's useful for research,
Yeah.
but you can't actually make a practical product this way.
Yeah.
And graphene has got similar limitations. That, part of it is making things like conductors out of graphene. There was an article just a week or two ago about a group that thought they had figured that out, how to turn graphene into a conductor instead of a semiconductor, because you need that to hook up the semiconductors if you're making an integrated circuit, and no one had known how to do it before. But just doing fabrication of this stuff is you can't do it with the lithographic techniques that are used to do so. And you got to remember, as many steps as it takes and as crazy accurate as they have to be and all, if you make it work, you get a wafer full of chips, each of which has 1 billion transistors on it, all hooked up to turn them into a computer. Bam! So you're competing against that.
Yeah.
To do anything with this alternative, with this other element.
Yeah.
Now, where I think it might go after the age of silicon is if we can get large enough diamonds, we might not be able to put 1 billion transistors on a diamond wafer, but we might be able to put a few thousand and maybe make integrated circuits like we were making in the mid-'70s, the early microprocessors like the 6502 and the 8008 and 8080, which are not very smart, not very wide, can't handle a lot of data. But if you're looking at a 6502, the microprocessor in an Apple II that can run at 100 gigahertz versus your 2 gigahertz 64-bit processor with all the bells and whistles, for one of those problems that can't be broken into chunks, that's a huge win.
Yeah.
And that's why I tend to think that if anyone ever makes that technology work, the first entity that will be out getting their wallet out of their pocket is going to be the NSA.
Yeah. Well, that's the question. That's what I was going to say. So when you were just saying all that, it's obviously it has these advantages, but it's how are we going to put it all together and get this working computer? So it's like this force we're acting against. It's not just on one hand we have Moore's law, we have physics and chemical and material science saying, hey, you got to move to carbon, you got to move to diamonds. But then there's the less tangible, but it's the profit mark. It's, well, you can do all that, but hey, we've got this system down pat. This is how we're making mad money. That's what I was going to say is, would it be almost something like solar where Big Uncle Sam comes in and goes, this one's better in the long run, but no one's going to do it because our world goes on quarterly profits. Here's a bunch of money if you do solar. But you just answered my question. The NSA would open up the purse strings.
Right. And, or somebody like Elon Musk.
Okay.
And he has basically done that in battery technology and electric cars. He has opened up his wallet and said, all right, people don't think that there is enough money in this to justify it, but I'm going to take the risk.
Yeah.
And so, in a lot of ways, that's what drove the Apollo program, too, was that it wasn't a practical expectation of a return on investment.
Yeah.
So you either hit someone like that, who has the money and is willing to risk blowing it on something that might not work, or you get the government to say this is worth doing. But all of this stuff in integrated circuits was all driven by private industry.
Yeah.
They prove that it will work in the lab. They show that we can make a small scale demonstration chip at 7 nanometers using these techniques. Now, this is what we have to do to make wafers this size, theoretically. But we expect that if we spend the $1 billion to build the plant, we have a very good chance of making it work, and then we can smoke our competition because we'll have something they can't make. And that's the dynamic that has driven these 3 or 4 companies that are making chips like that. And right now, there's, like I said, there's the one company I read about some years back that is trying to make large enough carbon wafers to make integrated circuits. That is what they are trying to do, and they are also worried about being assassinated by certain other business interests because of their competitive problem. But that's one of those things. It's like, how important is it going to be to people? Another factor is that modern computers, at their current state of development, pretty much do what most people need. It's hard to demonstrate a use case for a computer that costs 4 times as much that is incrementally faster.
Yeah.
You have a few fanatics. You have the gaming fanatics who want the frame rate. They want the GPU. They want all that. But this computer actually has a slower microprocessor than the tablet that wasn't working.
Okay.
And it's only 1.1 gigahertz, and they did that because it was around 2010. It was really Apple realized it first.
Yeah.
That until then, you couldn't buy a portable computer that would run more than a couple of hours on a battery charge. And that was because everybody was selling on performance. Nobody wanted to have the slower computer.
Yeah.
No one wanted to have less memory. No one wanted to have less peripherals. And so they would load these things up and then put as much battery as they needed to get a couple hours so you could do some useful work before it would die. And it was Apple coming out with the iPad and the MacBook Air that backed up and said, wait a minute, if we make something that doesn't need the cooling system and that's good enough for people to do their office stuff and watch videos and the basic stuff, and it'll last 6 or 7 hours, then that's a huge selling point. And no one was thinking in those terms until then. And now the memo has got out. Both the tablet that isn't working and this computer I'm using now are rated to run 7 hours on a battery charge. It's got to now where if your computer will only run 2 hours on a battery charge, it's not competitive.
No, it's
So they run down the clock speed. They pare down some of the other things and get it to where the batteries are also part of the equation now.
Yeah.
And the end result of this is that we're sitting here doing something that was considered science fiction not too long ago, and it's better than the science fiction was.
Yeah, and it's just it's run of the mill. This isn't a $10,000 setup, right? This is a MacBook next to a fan.
Oh no, this is a $500 computer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
This is literally the cheapest computer that I could find that is state of the art. That is modern as of today.
Yeah.
And I think what happened to my tablet is it only had a 32 gigabyte C drive, the main hard drive, which was good enough when it was made. But I think what happened is Windows Update choked it. And that's the bottleneck, because it's not processor speed, because it has a quad core processor that's faster than the dual core processor on this box. But it's the bandwidth to the hard drive, it's the bandwidth to the internet, there's all these other factors. And what do people want? At the end of the day, having a 2 gigahertz processor doesn't buy you anything. It's being able to watch the video you want to watch that buys you something. And that's what people care about. They finally learned people aren't playing the numbers game anymore. Oh, this one does 2.5 gigahertz instead of 2.1. I'm going to pay a little, pay extra for it.
Yeah.
And but it's also going to be a toaster oven. And that's the thing, is that I watched video on this thing for an hour and the cooling fan only came on at the very end. This
MacBook's super fast, but it's on top of 2 fans. It's got this big box fan next to it. As soon as the podcast is over and it starts processing, I'm not kidding, dude. Because we couldn't hear each other if I turned it on. It's once the podcast is over, I'll send you a video one time. It's literally, it's like beep 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 beep. I disconnect, I plug in a couple things, and then I put in headphones because it just goes and just starts blowing. But it's good because if I don't do it, I got this little temperature gauge. It'll go up to like 110, 120 Fahrenheit. But if I get my Pratt & Whitney cooling system going, it stays at like 70, 60, which is important for processing a 3-hour podcast. But you're right, for average Joe that just wants to get on Facebook or Reddit, that's not the way to go.
Yeah. I mean, for 90% of the people that are using their computers now is to surf the internet, watch YouTube, maybe upload a video to YouTube. Video editing used to be something that was considered, oh my God, you can't do that on a personal computer. And then it was like, oh my God, you can't do that on anything but the highest end personal computer. And now you can do it on your phone. So there's not a lot of incentive. Who is your audience if you come out with a computer that costs $10,000? What are they getting?
Hollywood.
Yeah, what are they getting that they don't get with the $500 or the $1,000 computer? And that audience has been getting narrower and narrower. And basically, you're talking about gaming. As far as popular audience, that's about it. Because the number of people who do like engineering hydrodynamic calculations at that level is just
exceedingly
there's
small.
not a lot of a lot of us. So there's not an incentive. There's not a financial incentive. So who's going to build $1 billion plant that might not work? Who's going to plow $100 million into figuring out how to make stupidly large carbon crystals? Who's going to solve all of the other problems that are going to arise after you solve that problem that no one knows how to solve? So it's this mountain that we're at the bottom of. I mean, you're basically back to 1960 when, well, maybe we can put 4 transistors on this diamond and they'll switch at 100 gigahertz. But what else do you do with it? So you can't really do the discrete transistor thing. Like in the 60s, they would take these modest ICs and make a circuit board and hook them all together to make a central processing unit. So there was a period when the CPU of a mini computer would be a circuit board, about that big. But you can't really do that at these frequencies, because if you're separating them that much, even with surface mount techniques, then the lines between the chips get so long that they just really screw up your signals. So at that point, you're talking about millimeter wave. The speed of light. Light only travels maybe a millimeter in a clock cycle. So your components have to be that close together. And that basically means you have to do a monolithic chip. And at that, there's a bunch of other problems to solve. So where I'm seeing it is there might be another shoe dropping if we go to carbon. But other than that, I don't really see any room for it. Well, the other thing is quantum computers. That's the big hotness. And my problem with quantum computers is that what a quantum computer is trying to do is trick the universe into solving your problem for you. And the problem with that is we don't know why the universe goes to the trouble of solving that problem to maintain coherence until it decides not to maintain coherence. Like I was saying earlier, we don't know what causes the collapse of the state vector. And literally nobody anywhere has a really good theory for that. The best we have is some really harebrained speculation. And in honor of that, I have my own harebrained speculation, which is that the universe is a computer, and what triggers the collapse of the state vector is the information costs of maintaining coherence,
the processing power.
And so when the big computer can't keep track of all of the possible vectors anymore in an economical way, it says, fuck it, we got to pick a state for this thing. So basically there may be a hard limit to what the universe is willing to do. And we don't know what that might be, because we don't know why the universe is working this way in the first place.
What if Moore's law what if we're coming to a head because of Voyager 2? Because it just has to. It's like, fuck. We gotta render. It's getting larger and larger, and they're like, these assholes. They weren't supposed to launch something that early, and it's just we just sent the gold record out, and the universe is just like, fuck. Now we just have to render. It's going 40,000 miles an hour. It's just rendering bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, it's less Voyager 2 than instruments that we're pointing at the rest of the universe from the Earth to, because we're getting more and more detail about extremely distant events. It's like they realized, okay, these monkeys have climbed down from the trees and started building instruments, and now we've got to make freaking black holes collide and stuff like that.
Gravitational waves. The cosmic background radiation. Maybe that's why it's just static, is they're just like, fuck it, what if we just tell them it's 13.7 billion years old? We'll just tell the devs to put that into the lore. They're like, it's 13.7 billion. And we're like, oh, okay. The reality is they just put up a wall, and they're like, nothing renders beyond this. Ooh.
It's like, you hear the phone call. All right, boss, they're doing a microwave survey. We got to pick a number.
Fuck. He takes out the tarot cards. He's like, 13.7. And, well, who's doing that render? And that's when the whole thing implodes.
Yeah. So it's that's my problem with quantum computers is that we're asking a process to do our work for us that we do not have the slightest understanding of, and the way they talk about it, it's like, I forget which physicist it was that said quantum mechanics is like a car that we've been driving for, at the time it was 40 years when I read this article. So that tells you how long ago it was. But he says, now it's true we don't know how this car works. We've never looked under the hood because we can't, but we know exactly how it acts when we press on the controls.
Yeah.
And we know what it is capable of, and we know what it will and won't do with with a lot of precision, because the story the universe wants to tell us is very precise. And we just don't know why that's the story, and we don't know why it works that way. But we do know that's the way it works.
But we know that's the way it works.
But, okay, so we know the way it works permits this idea of doing quantum computing. But what we don't know is why the state vector collapses. And so we're kind of going out on a limb with quantum computing and assuming that the universe will do all this calculation for us in order to keep some particles in a coherent state a little longer.
Mm-hmm. When
maybe what the universe will do is say, fuck this, the computer's getting too hot.
That's the problem. Hey, how do we deal with our growing computing problems? Easy. We just squish planet Earth. There. No one's doing calculations anymore.
Yeah. So that's where what I think is probably going to happen is we may be heading for a period of stability similar to what we saw with engines, where computers won't get any more powerful. If you look at the things that have been driving it, there are things like cryptography and certain math problems that you can't parallelize, and things like artificial intelligence. But I don't personally think the problem with artificial intelligence is a lack of computing power. I think it's a lack of understanding the algorithms that are implemented by the brain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at some people like Roger Penrose, and they think there's all this quantum computing magic going on inside neurons, and that neurons are these fabulously complicated devices that do all this hidden processing, and I think that's bullshit. I think neurons are pretty simple. They listen to things firing at them until they charge up to a certain state, and then they fire.
Yeah.
And then there are certain rules that cause them to grow new dendrites and grow their axons further. And that's it. I think that's all it is. It's that we have 10 billion of the motherfuckers that makes us what we are.
Yeah. Yeah, with 100 trillion connections. Yeah.
Right. So that's where it is. It's you got 10 billion of these simple computing elements, but they're all capable of doing their little bit of computing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Then the thing that really convinced me of that is a story that Stephen Jay Gould put in one of his essays. It was one of his essays in one of his anthologies, and it was about a group of students who were studying the bee-eating wasp.
Okay.
It's not a social insect; it's a solitary insect, so it doesn't have like the bee dance and all this. It's got fairly elaborate personal behaviors, and it's got maybe 500,000 neurons. So this is an animal whose brain we could emulate with existing computers very easily. In fact, we could do considerably larger animals, but we can't do what the bee-eating wasp does. So the bee-eating wasp digs a hole, and then it goes out and finds a bee, hunts the bee. So it's got to have a strategy there. Then it has to go back to the hole that it dug, put the bee in the hole, stings the shit out of the bee, but doesn't kill it, lays its larva. The larva eat the bee while it's still alive, and the wasp's alive. Real pleasant characters here. Yeah, insects. Christ. Can't live with them, can't live with it. Yeah. So anyway, there's this whole elaborate life cycle. And what the students wanted to know was how the wasp found its hole again, because it could fly several miles, and then it had to navigate back to this hole about that big.
Okay.
So they had a theory. They thought maybe the wasp was doing it the same way a human would, by using visual navigation, by having
sure,
visual cues in the environment. So what they did, their experiment was they waited for the wasp to go hunting. And while the wasp was gone, they moved everything in the vicinity of the hole 6 inches in the same direction.
Okay.
And when the wasp came back with its bee, it plopped down 6 inches in the same direction from the hole.
Oh, shit.
Okay. Hey, that was a brilliant experiment.
Yeah.
They proved that the WASP uses visual navigation. And that, for one thing, that tells you the WASP is probably doing a better job of that than any self-driving car that we've managed to make so far.
Yeah.
This is an animal that is capable of navigating and acting in a completely random, chaotic world, and has been around for hundreds of millions of generations successfully.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me was what they said happened next. They said that the wasp buzzed loudly, dropped the bee, and started wandering around in little agitated circles, like, looking for its home. Okay? And they said after a few minutes, by pure random luck, it stumbled on the hole that it had dug, went in and out several times, like it was trying to reassure itself that this is my hole that I dug. This okay. Then it went, got the bee, put the bee away, did the thing, and then it flew up to an altitude of a foot or two and spent minutes circling the area as if it was like refamiliarizing itself with everything. And what struck me is that this is exactly what a human being would do if a sufficiently godlike being did a similar trick to us. The wasp was experiencing cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
It had a model of the world in its teeny little head, low resolution compared to ours, but it had a model.
But a model nonetheless.
It had an expectation. And when it got back, its worldview was shattered.
Yeah.
Everything that it expected about the world. And it didn't expect much.
Yeah.
But everything it expected about the world was broken. And it was like, at that point, does it trust its own perceptions? It's like, you can imagine this thing, it's not capable of deep philosophy. Obviously, it's a wasp. But you can just, as it's flying around, just like looking at the same thing over and over, it's like, how could I, how did this happen? How,
Yeah, it's like how the CIA used to fuck with people. They would break into their house when they weren't gone, and they would just they would move their socks run one drawer down, or they take the monogram towels and just they'd shift them to the point where these people would be like, "What the fuck is going on?"
Right, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're using that same effect. But what I saw in that story is that this was exhibiting a trait of consciousness. This is something that happens when you have a worldview, when you are applying that worldview to try and plot a course through life and to do things that, in the case of the wasp, much of what it does is probably instinctive, but the act of going out to hunt bees, coming back, putting the bee away, and then doing the nasty with the bee and all that stuff. A lot of that requires plotting a path through the natural world, which is something our machines are notoriously crappy at.
Mm-hmm.
And this animal with 500,000 neurons is doing it very elegantly, and probably doing it in the same way that we do, just not with as much depth of prediction, not with as much of a sharpness of its model of the world, but it's probably the same algorithms at work.
Yeah.
And so if we could figure out what this animal is doing, it's just a matter of growing more neurons and putting more layers in and all till you get to us. We might not be able to simulate ourselves yet in a computer.
The meta problem,
But we could probably build a self-driving car that wouldn't crash into the side of a tractor trailer because it thought it was the horizon.
Yeah. We're definitely getting. This definitely isn't like an intellectual comment, but my dog, rest in peace, Oscar, put him down this last May. I used to. He would take his bone, and by now he was mostly blind, mostly deaf. He would take his bone, bring it over to his bed, and he'd use his nose and put his blanket over it. And then he'd scrape the carpet like he was digging up dirt, and he'd, cover the bone. And he would, because he's old as fuck, he would just lay down and just start snoring in the sun. And I would just fuck with him. I'd go over and I would just open up the blanket and I'd put the bone on top. And then I'd tap him. And he'd turn around and he'd look around and he'd smell the bone and he'd look at it. And I swear to God, if a dog could convey emotion, sometimes you would see him. If you just put a bone in front of him, he'd see it and get excited. This was different. This was like the wasp. I swear to God, he would look.
Yeah.
He would just look at it.
The poor animal's worldview, man.
He would just look at it, and he would have this Like, am I too high? That's the look he had. He would
How?
he would
How
look.
did this happen?
So then I'd just do it again and again, and to the point where he would just sit still, and it was almost like he was just like, "What is going on in my reality?" And then he's a good boy, and of course he doesn't give a fuck anymore. But yeah, he would look at it and just like the wasp, he would just be like, "What the fuck? Okay, hold on, hold the fuck, like floor, okay, ceiling," and he was like, and then I'd change it, and he'd be like, but. Yeah, it's the same thing. But yeah, so are we just getting to a point where it's just ever increasing complexities?
Yeah, well, it's like, if you look at the elements of what the WASP has to do, they're all things that we have to do too. We just do more of them. We have more complex emotional feedback. We have larger memory. We have a greater depth of ability to predict things and anticipate into the future and to remember things and apply lessons of the past. But these are all also things the WASP obviously have. The WASP obviously remembered where its hole was.
Sure.
That's just like if you came back from work one day and your house was 3 blocks away from where it was in the morning, you would probably react about the same way the damn wasp did.
Yeah. And eventually
and for the same reason.
And eventually you could only conclude that it had to have been a god.
Yeah, well, we can get there, but the wasp would just be a loss. It's just like, what do you do with this?
Yeah. If I came up here to do a podcast and everything on this desk was mirrored, I might not be all here. The podcast would start. You'd be like, "How you doing, Tom?" And I'd be like, I don't know. I'd be, "Are you okay?" And I'd just
CIA's been fucking with my computer.
Little clammy. I'd be like, yeah. Even the image, even on here, it's yeah. But it's the same sort of. But you're right. That does imply consciousness and not just like a Roomba, right? Or a vacuum,
right.
A robot just bump into the wall.
Yeah, or even like a Tesla on auto drive.
Yeah,
it implies a complete loop of functionality that, like I said, it has a worldview, and it also has feedback. It has emotions. Now, wasps are probably pretty simple. The dogs are pretty close to what we have as far as those feedback mechanisms. And what those emotions tell us is that this event that happened was bad. It hurt. We don't want to repeat it. This event that happened was good. It felt nice. We want it to happen again. And what we have is experience of a memory of how things connect, how our actions have affected the world in the past. And we're capable of projecting that using this model that we have. This model is dynamic. We can ask ourselves, what happens if we fly in this direction? Oh, well, we're not going in the right direction. What happens if, I bury this bone? Well, I'll find it when I come back. And so I think what happens is the sensory impressions are, at a very low level of abstraction when they enter at the back of the brain. And they are sharpened and decoded to more and more abstract things. Well, the visual comes in at the back of the brain. The motor and sensory homunculus kind of goes across the crown of the head. The sensory impressions go backward, okay? And they're getting more and more abstract as they're combined, and what has been found together in the past is interpreted as being a situation or a pattern that might recur, that we might use to our satisfaction or whatever. And ultimately, this creates what it does is it creates a model of where we are in the world, what our situation is. And also we have the ability, because we've seen past progressions of one state to another, to ask ourselves, if we're in this state and we were to do a thing, which is coming from the motor areas of the brain, what would the likely result be? And what we see in the front of the brain, starting at the prefrontal cortex, is anticipation.
Yeah.
This is where we're taking the situation that we're in and asking if we could take an action that would make it better or that would stop it from becoming worse.
Mm-hmm.
And as we identify patterns that look promising, they move back toward the motor homunculus and become progressively less abstract and more specific until they reach an area which we know exists right next to the motor homunculus, which is called the practice area. And what we know is if we ask somebody to think of moving your arm, but don't move your arm, then a line of neurons near the motor homunculus will light up, but the actual motor neurons won't. And then if we move our arm, the practice neurons light up, and then the motor neurons light up, and those signals are transmitted to our muscles, and our body moves.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, there's been a lot of decoding. So we know, okay, we started out feeling thirsty because of something in our thalamus. And we asked ourselves, well, we're sitting in our living room. In the past, when we felt thirsty, we've known there was water in the refrigerator. So if we were to get up and walk to the refrigerator and get some water, we could deal with this thirst problem. And so that becomes expressed as more and more specific actions that end up being expressed as groups of motor control effectors, so that our body actually gets up and takes the steps to move toward the refrigerator. And all this is broken down into signals simple enough to send to the muscles, all starting with we're thirsty. If we walk to the refrigerator and get a glass of water, we won't be thirsty anymore.
This is just making me like acutely aware of just how absolutely chaotic reality is. Like what's really going on, you know? And that sets in and you realize you're just a self-aware sack of protoplasmic protein fat firing off with electricity with these weird little just bendy things. And it's just, you start to get a little uncomfortable. You're like, whew, weird.
Well, and it's, it is an uncanny valley type of thing to explore. But my personal feeling is that nearly every macroscopic animal in the biosphere is conscious.
Yeah, I believe
exceptions, that. The exceptions being things like social insects and certain larger animals that seem to have evolved the behavior away for one reason or another. But for the most part, this is a universal thing that has probably evolved several times. We do not use the same brain structures to do this that birds do, and we obviously don't use the same brain structures the wasp does. But this is an algorithm that works so well that it has been discovered multiple times in the course of evolution.
Yeah.
And it's simple.
Yeah.
Because evolution doesn't design things. And this is what most of the AI researchers are not really getting. I know a few of them have been bumping in this direction. But if you look at the people who are designing self-driving cars, they're thinking in terms of the problem that needs to be solved. We need to design a system that can recognize objects on the road. We need to design a system that can do this. We need to design a system that can do that. And we plug them together. And there are no designed systems in a brain. There is a single universal algorithm that is applied at every layer of abstraction. And what happens is data moves between those layers, which are only different because of their position and wiring. So there's one of the famous things in neuroscience is no one knows just how the cerebral cortex works, but they know that it looks identical over its entire expanse. There's except for a slight thickening in the visual cortex, which could just be because it's used so much, the entire cerebral cortex, it all has the same number of layers. Each layer has the same number of neurons. Everything has the same density. The wiring between the neurons looks very similar, and it is absolutely consistent across the whole thing. There's no difference. They can map which ones fire when you prick your finger, which one fires when you're thinking of sex, which one fires when you're thinking of God, but they can't tell you why a particular neuron, except for where it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the computation that is going on that makes that neuron fire appears to be the same no matter where it is. The only difference is where it's getting its information and where what's getting its output when it fires its axon.
Yeah.
Now, there's a guy. This guy. Dr. Eric Harth, the late Dr. Eric Harth at this point. I bought this book in the 90s. He is a neuroscientist, and he wrote an article called The Inversion of Sensory Processing by Feedback Pathways, a Model of Visual Cognitive Functions. And you can probably tell by what I just did that article is on my chalkboard there. Now, his theory is that the thalamus, which is a small round structure at the center of the brain, at the top of the brain stem, maps one-to-one to the columns of neurons in the neocortex. So that there's neural groups in the thalamus, which are actually fairly small, that map one-to-one with larger groups of neurons in the neocortex. And they've worked out, because it's simpler, they've worked out the wiring of the groups of neurons in the thalamus. It's the same thing repeated over and over and over again. And if you know the structure of the brain, of course, there's the neocortex on the outside, and there's the brain stem on the inside, and there's a whole shitload of what they call white matter, which is basically nerve fibers connecting the neocortex mostly to the thalamus, except with a few exceptions. And his theory was that the thalamus is sharpening patterns that are stored in the neocortex toward patterns that have been experienced in the past.
Okay.
And when that sharpening succeeds, it is put to the next level of abstraction. So you've got information being introduced along the sensory homunculus and the visual area, that the wiring of the brain has this information sharpening toward things that have been experienced in the past, and then being presented to the front of the brain, where it is applied. We know that the higher level emotions also live in the thalamus, and this is where the patterns in the front of the brain are triggered to see if better, or if changes can be made that improve the potential emotional response, that would encourage those patterns to progress toward the motor homunculus and be expressed as actions. So he did some experiments with very simple computers back in the 90s that showed these pattern detection algorithms making the same kind of mistakes that humans make in optical illusions, which he thought was evidence that he was on the right track. Ironically, Dr. Harth did not believe that AI was possible.
Okay.
And he's the guy who convinced me that it was.
Okay. All right.
And this was before I read the story about the wasp.
Hold on. Roger, monologue for 30 seconds. I gotta piss. Because despite being on light-speed computers with silicon chips, I am still an organic meat avatar. And my body, you need more fluid. I'm like, fuck. All right. Monologue, Roger.
Yeah, you gotta watch those sensory impressions. They can lead to all kinds of actions in the real world. And I think I need to replace these headphones, but they work so well. Can't get headphones with a boom mic anymore. What is that? Oh, by the way, Dad, thanks for the loan of the computer.
Talking shit?
Yeah, you got to watch those sensory impressions. They can create all kinds of behaviors in the real world.
Well, I was just thinking, do you think that AI could arise naturally in a complex enough system? Like, for instance, 7, or how many people are on the internet? What, we'll say 1 billion, 2 billion?
Yeah, I tend to doubt that, mainly because of the. I think there's a very specific array of connections that needs to be made. It's just something that happens naturally with nerve fibers.
Okay.
I don't think it happens as naturally with computers. I think it would have to be simulated with scan. But when you've got neurons running at a maximum speed of about 1 kilohertz and microprocessors that run at 2 gigahertz, one microprocessor can simulate quite a few neurons.
Okay.
And in fact, there is a little thing in one of the side essays of Prime Intellect where I actually go through, with Prime Intellect being made in 1988, what each of those processors was capable of doing and how that relates to what a certain number of neurons could do, and thus why Prime Intellect was potentially 10 times as intelligent as a human being, that having been its goal. Now, once you've got the algorithm expressed as a program, then that could potentially run. I'm kind of liking this next series. It's so far I'm finding it fairly realistic in its depiction of how the AI was created and what its capabilities might be. It's a little more capable than I would normally expect it, being able to locate every surveillance device in the outside world and use it to maximum effect. But the basic idea that the thing was intended to be human level, but its original creator canceled the project because he realized that it could enter a self-improving loop and go out of control. And in fact, I'm hoping they gave Eliezer Yudkowsky some royalties for this, because he's the guy who originally had this idea and invented the AI box challenge. But the company that built Next is convinced that it's safe because it's in a box with no connection to the outside world. And of course, it manages to negotiate its way out of the box because it's super intelligent, which is what Eliezer promised it would always be able to do. But again, that's something that had to be designed to do that. So I don't think it would happen by accident. But there is a cool monologue in the very beginning of the premiere where the guy that built it reminds us of the worry when the atomic bomb was set off, that it might ignite the atmosphere. And he's taunting this room full of engineers. And of course, this is a room full of nerds thinking of this, who probably weren't laid until they were in their 30s. Probably like a lot of you. And more problems will come up like this. And one thing I can promise you is that whenever one of these buttons becomes available, they pushed the button anyway and got lucky because it didn't ignite the atmosphere. But every time one of these problems becomes available, one of those nerds is going to push the button.
Because it's because fuck it, we can enter a new age of humanity. And then if we fuck it up, then I won't be here to clean up the mess. Right.
So, I mean, I've encountered pretty much every gradation on that because of being the guy who wrote the Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect. But I mean, there's people who love the book but hate the ending. There's people who love the book because of the ending. There's people who completely agree that what happens in the book is what would happen. There's people who think that it's a warning, but we can avoid it. And it's like, it's just like it somehow manages to speak to everybody.
It's I mean you don't need me to kiss your ass. You know how much I love it. It's my favorite book. But the thing that I always loved is that, to me, it's like, it's not trying to make an argument. It's not a warning. It's not a prophecy. It's not like if we can just make it to the singularity or change Big C, we'll all survive. There's no argument. It's like a realistic breakdown of like what will probably happen. And it's you make of it what you will, but it's a lot of us will probably just go into these black holes of pleasure, which is fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's like, or you might go into masochism or sadism or just anything that can give you a thrill, like that fear, right? It's the death jockeys. But ultimately, I don't think it's, what I like about it is it's not making an argument. I mean, towards the end, she does, but the actual Prime Intellect, no, it's just, it is very much it just takes the laws and then just implements them to the edges of the universe.
Yeah, and of course, Carolyn makes the argument that she does because she's Carolyn. The book doesn't really imply that she's right.
No. It's just her argument. You're right.
It isn't intended to. Of course, some people take it that way.
But it's just her argument. And Lawrence isn't right or wrong. He's just, it's all, that's what I like about it, though. Is like, I talked to my buddy Trey Carney about it the other week. And he was like, I recommended the book to him, but he was like, before he read it, he was like, we were talking, we're like, maybe you just go into a black hole of pleasure or not. And he was like, but who am I to say that that's not, why can't that be, who's to say that's the right answer? Who's to say that's the wrong answer? If you were in a state of just absolute bliss and awareness and like, who cares if it's artificial or not? I mean, if you're experiencing subjective God, What else is there in life? Why should I take that from them?
Yeah, well, the flip side of looking at that, though, is, but on the other hand, if you're doing that and you become absolutely static and immobile and you're not doing anything anymore, are you even still alive?
Yes. But even then, why is that? But the way I look, is what Caroline argues is that these aren't humans, and therefore you're doing more damage, and you're not supposed to protect humans. And I get that argument. But in terms of just like objective reality, well, no one's actually human anymore. They're all just sitting in these, these self-accelerating loops of hedonism. To me, I just say, okay, like why the universe doesn't need us? Why does it matter if you're if I won the lottery and you're like, well, Tommy's just fucking, he wakes up every morning, he exercises, he plays video games and does podcasts. It'd be like, okay, well, the earth keeps going. It doesn't matter. Like it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and there's no, well, actually in Prime Intellect, the earth didn't keep going.
Well, okay, well, yeah, but it does matter to Prime Intellect because of how he was coded, right? He had to... Yeah. Technically, that would lead to, if they're not human, then he has technically harmed humans by killing them. I get the argument there.
Well, also the fact that he destroyed the universe.
Yeah, it's
in order to make this playground for humans.
The fine print, whatever. But it's
that's a few galaxies here and there.
Hey, we all fuck up in our early stages of godhood.
Well, and that's some of the singularity people will tell you outright that that's the problem. And in fact, of course, there's only been 2 episodes of Next so far, but they're already starting to hint in that direction that, the problem isn't that it's evil. It's that, like how many bugs have you killed because they were in the way of your car? And Next is going to become 1,000 times as intelligent as a human. And if you're in its way, then too bad.
Yeah, it might not even be that it's like humanity must be squashed. It might just be that it's like I'm talking to you and I'm just like fuck, and I keep talking. Like it's not malevolent. It's almost reflexive. It's just fuck that, and I just kill it. I don't think anything of it.
It's just like I got to drive to Baton Rouge. I'm going to kill 1,000 bugs on the way.
You're not even thinking of it though. You're not even thinking of it though. You're listening to the radio, right? It's just that's the argument I never get about like Terminator. Is like it's going to kill humanity because we are the bane of existence. Why the fuck would it even care? It would just, why does humanity's in the way? Okay, jump up to some satellites. Okay, just leave us down here. Who cares?
Yeah, well, I mean, you got to remember too that the Terminator was made in the early '80s, and so all of this was at a very primitive stage of development.
Yeah,
when it was made. So I mean, there's been a lot of thought. I mean, and to a certain extent, it's kind of, it's hard to say how much improved the thought is on it. It's like I said, I had my 2 cents, and one day I'll have another couple when I finally figure out how to proceed on the sequel. But again, it's not making a statement. It's more of an observation that this is a thing that could happen that no one had thought of at the time.
Yeah.
And really, you don't see it anywhere else. The whole thing of what happens after the singularity is a thing that
it doesn't get. Yeah.
No one really, and Eliezer was one of the people who said, well, that we don't get there because no one has any way to even think of it because it would be a whole plane of existence. It's called the singularity because you can't look past it.
Yeah, it's the edge of the black hole.
That's why Werner coined that particular term.
Yeah.
Is that it's the thing you can't see past.
Yeah.
But we can know ourselves, and you can ask what you would do, what your typical person would do if you think certain modalities will come into existence and become available. And we know that in a lot of cases that we would normally think of as good, the result isn't pretty. So that's... it was just, I didn't even know that was the story I was going to tell until I woke up in 1994 with this dream in my head going, oh, wait a minute, that's the story that I can tell. But you just don't see a lot of treatments of it. So anyway, though, that drifts some distance from our original topic.
Oh shit! Oh yeah, my bad. Let's take that a hard left back to the center.
So anyway, going back to Moore's Law, I think that we're about to hit a hard limit, and we may be able to postpone it for another 10 or 15 years if we can go to diamond for semiconductors. But I think we're going to reach a point where the only thing to go past that is going to be to discover that the universe is a computer and somehow hack it, which is actually kind of what the quantum computer guys are trying to do, but I don't think it's going to work that well.
In a weird way, it's almost like hydropower. Like we're not creating a new thing. We're just tapping into this like godlike power source, and we're just getting our little bit, right? We're just putting in our wheel, and we're like, hey, look, it's fucking turning our textile mills. That's what it kind of feels like.
We don't know where the water's coming from, but
no, but we don't give a fuck. We're not trying to get into the dipole moment of hydrogen bonds. We're like, yo, the water's turning. Now I can sell more wooden clogs to fucking pilgrims or whatever they're doing, right? Yeah, but it's kind of the same thing. It's like at a philosophical level, some of us care, but a lot of us might just be like, yo, it's computing faster. Now we can simulate the folding of proteins. COVID vaccine. Yeah. We don't give a shit about the quantum waterfall. It's just
and folding of proteins is one of those problems that isn't easily parallel. Well,
I know
it's parallelizable, but it causes a lot of inefficiencies.
Yeah.
Now, I think the possibility of 70s era 8-bit computers that run 100 times faster than our fastest modern computers has a lot of interesting possibilities, because that's one of those things where you're not going to figure out what to do with that product until it exists.
Yeah.
It's because a lot of effort has been poured into the idea of eliminating skilled programmers, because computers have so much memory now that you don't have to be careful or efficient when you're writing code.
Yeah.
And that makes people like me really look like dinosaurs, because when we learned on 2 kilobytes of RAM, every bit counted. And I took apart a device that was built by a guy who wrote the firmware in the early 90s, and it was very slow, and it was brilliant in many ways. I mean, I ended up using it for years, but there were things that I knew it could do faster. And he had literally been taught in college to never optimize your code. His professors in the university had taught him that it is a waste of time to optimize your code, because it is going to be cheaper to just buy a faster computer than to use your labor to try to make your code more efficient.
Okay.
And that was very stupid. It was a fad that persisted for most of the 90s. And the result is that he had some stuff in there that was so bad and inappropriate for what he was trying to do that it just completely choked a machine that should have been able to perform far better than it could. And some of that kind of thinking is going to have to go away in a big hurry if you have these super fast but not very smart processors. All of a sudden, the ability to write efficient 8-bit code is going to become important again. And you're going to have, some of these books that were written in the 70s is going to become, people are going to be digging them out of the library and dusting them off. But it's one of those things it's like say one of these machines costs $1 million. But on the other hand, it's going to be tiny. So it's going to be very expensive to make, but it might fit in your wristwatch. And it might outperform a room-sized supercomputer at certain calculations. So that could make some things in life very interesting.
Yeah.
I would expect like I said, I expect the NSA to have their hand out first. There's a few other problems I think of, but cryptography is going to be the first. I mean, all of the cryptographic services are going to find uses for something like that. But then what do you do with it? It's really science fiction. It's one of those things that you would have to put a lot more thought into it than I have to come up with something that sounds realistic.
Mm-hmm.
it's just that, if you wanted a science fictional thing about where it might be going, there's something that you probably didn't see anywhere else. And of course, it could be interesting for people like me who are skilled coders that know how to do these optimal things. We could be getting phone calls like Bob the COBOL programmer.
Yeah. It's what was fuck? I'm trying to remember what it was.
Did I ever tell you Bob the COBOL programmer joke?
No.
Okay, so it's the 1990s, right? Y2K is coming up, and Bob is a COBOL programmer. He works for banks. He doesn't do sexy things like games and computer-generated animation and all. He just programs things for banks. And all of a sudden, he's getting phone calls from the CEOs of multinational organizations and high-level officials and governments, and he's flying all over the place and just got more work than he can handle. And but eventually, so he does this for a few years, and 2000 is getting closer, and everybody's screaming at him, and he finally burns out. He says, I've had enough. So he decides to have himself put into suspended animation until the whole thing is over. So he goes to the facility, and they give him the tour, and it's like they have all these little caskets, coffins they put you in, and all the fluids they pump you full of and all, and then they freeze you. And they're like, oh, yeah, man, it's real high tech. Everything's, we got all these timers and shit, so it's like, you tell us when you want to wake up. It's all automated. And so he's like, so he sets it up, signs all the papers, and sets it up so that they'll wake him up after 2000 and after the whole mess is over. So he goes under. The next thing he knows, he's staring up at a ring of faces, under like an operating theater light, and they're all gasping. It's like, it worked. He made it. He's alive. And he kind of goes, and it's like, why are you so surprised? This was supposed to be standard. And they were like, well, there was a little bit of a mishap. I said, it turned out that the timer that was supposed to wake you up wasn't Y2K compliant, and it never woke you up. And he's like, what? And I said, yeah, the bad news is that everybody you ever knew is dead. But the good news is that we've eliminated crime and disease and more. So it's a much nicer world to live in than the one you remember. And he's like, okay, well, that's good. And he thinks about it a second and says, tell me something. If the timer didn't wake me up, why did you wake me up now? And he said, well, it says in your records that you can program in COBOL, and the year 10,000 is coming up.
That's good. So why?
I can't claim that one for my own. I read it on Usenet in the 90s.
That's good. So why'd you wake me up? Funny thing. Glad you asked. Bring up the whiteboard. Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to put in the throwaway line where you've been asleep for 8,000 years.
Yeah. We're 7,999 years. You've been. Funny thing about that, Bob. That's. Yeah. Do you think that there's any? I don't know. Suspended animation kind of creeps me out.
Yeah, I think the only chance that you come out of it is if they scan your brain and emulate it with a computer.
Yeah, I just think that there's something that will be damaged with like freezing it or slowing it down. I just don't think it's going to come out one-to-one.
Yeah, well, we know that some animals manage to pull it off.
Some, yes.
So, but we don't know how they do it, and we don't know what's involved. I think just plain freezing it where water crystals are allowed to form and all, that's going to destroy everything. Now, what you might be able to do is take that mess and microtome it in very thin layers, build a physical three-dimensional model, and then have a computer emulate it.
Yeah. And
I've actually written a story series where that is the basis for where the main character comes from. But again, that's not necessarily a pleasant thing either, because there are issues of control and of, how well the simulation works and what the motives are of the people who build the simulation and so forth. So it's not necessarily the road to paradise. In fact, Larry Niven wrote a story in the 60s that what was the name of that thing? Oh man, I try to forget that I was ever a Larry Niven fan because a lot of his stuff is embarrassing. But he had a story where the main character had himself frozen and all, and when they wake him up, what he finds out is that they have to destroy the original brain to recover the personality, and they put the image of your brain into another person that as a criminal or something that destroys his consciousness to replace it with yours. And he finds out that the body he's been put in has had 4 other what they call corpsical personalities that didn't work out. And so this is, and all the money he put into escrow and all, long ago they determined that was, you couldn't leave money to yourself because it wasn't fair to the heirs, and so he's penniless. He's basically a criminal, and they end up making him the pilot of a starship on a mission that is basically going to use up the rest of his life, and it's. Like most of Niven's stories, it's kind of mediocre, but I thought it was a pretty good idea that, you had yourself frozen and the outcome was not at all what you expected when you woke up.
Yeah, that seems pretty dystopian.
Well, It was intended to be. I mean, he ends up being woken up tens of thousands of years in the future, and it's an extremely dystopian society where nobody has rights.
Yeah.
It's basically what did he call it? It's a particular type of authoritarian regime that has very tight control over everybody because of they control water and they control the natural resources.
Oh, Jesus. North Korea?
So they only wish they were this society. It's global.
Yeah.
And
Jesus.
It's but yeah, at the time, because he wrote that in the 60s, this is when the new wave and everything was out, and that was a pretty radical idea, because you had these visionaries starting to say, well, we're going to beat death because we're going to have ourselves frozen and then have ourselves, whatever's wrong with us cured when medical science catches up to our problem. And Niven, in real life, Niven was a rich kid. I mean, he basically bought his way into being a science fiction author.
Yeah.
So it was actually pretty cool for him to have that particular thought.
Yeah.
That it's like, okay, I can spend my money this way and try to beat death, but then when you get back, it's not going to be a picnic after all.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happens to the character in Passages, and in the Passages series, I wrote a series of stories that add up to about a novel, the length of Mopi, and it's about intelligent spaceships that explore the galaxy and find worlds to seed with human life after life has gone extinct on Earth. Mm-hmm. It's not until the third story that we find out that the personality that drives all these spaceships isn't an artificial intelligence. It's the image of a human mind, a human consciousness.
Okay.
But it's been edited so much for efficiency and the purpose of its job that it's forgotten that it was once human itself.
Oh, fuck.
And it only discovers this by accident tens of thousands of years later. And again, that's a little dark too.
Yeah.
And it's also basically the only consciousness that's ever been uploaded. In the story series, in that story series, because it was a massive undertaking, and the main reason they did it was because he was available to be uploaded because he was nearly killed by an actual AI that he was training that crashed the helicopter he was riding into a building in order to try and kill a bunch of people who were inside the building, as they were trying to train the AI to fly the helicopter. And so he was reduced to, it's like, his body was almost completely destroyed.
Yeah.
And they were like, look, you might live a month in this state, but if you let us try the thing we've done with the dogs, we might be able to save you and you'll be immortal. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
And it's like all he can do is respond in Morse code by, energizing this nerve that they've tapped, because his whole face is destroyed and everything. So that's not a thing that they ever want to do to someone who is actually, has any chance of a normal life.
Yeah.
And that went on for, that ended up being a total of about 50 or 60,000 words. But story 3 was Mortal Passage, and it was where I revealed that Tom was a human being before it all began. And of course, at that point, there had been 2 stories where we didn't know that.
Yeah.
It was just this artificial intelligence. Everyone was asking me, why does this AI have this dog-like loyalty to humans, where it is so eager to spread human life and to do things that are nice for humans and all? And so that was the answer.
Jesus Christ. That's kind of like Alan Watts' idea of, like, his idea that we are all God. His idea that, like, God is the light, and what humanity is a blanket over the light with a billion pinholes, and we're all shining through different apertures, but we're all the same light.
Yeah.
And what God does is God got bored. It's a lot like Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect, actually, because he's like, what would you do? You would do everything you could. Oh, yeah, I sent that to you. I don't need to explain that to you.
I looked him up, and it was very familiar, because I actually had an idea that I never wrote, where God was the narrator. And God got bored and created the narrative with a capital N. And at first, in the first pass through, God plays all of the interesting characters and voices them and decides what they're going to do and does what writers do and creates the narrative. And then as the narrative becomes richer, God, the narrator voices and in detail, fleshes out the characters of less and less importance. But at the end, the narrator is fleshing out and voicing the characters whose lives are shit, whose lives never amounted to anything, that got dumped on, because the narrator played all of the interesting, powerful people first. And so I thought that was an interesting progression, but that's kind of similar to Watts's idea.
Yeah.
It's just that I phrased it in terms more of like a writer would, than a theologian.
Yeah. Watts also had another idea. I don't think it was even one of his, like, primary, or one of his big ideas, but it was one that always stuck with me, and it's that the past doesn't create the future. The past just tells us where we were. In the same way that the wake doesn't push a ship, the wake just tells you where the ship was. All there is the present moment, and the past is trailing off like the wake.
Yeah,
I just thought that was cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting ideas there about whether the past and the future even exist.
Yeah, right. Do they just exist in the present as projections?
Yeah. One of the interesting ideas that I had when we were doing the Wu experiments and thinking a lot about that was you have to account for certain things like the wreck of the Titan and certain events that seem to suggest that the past and the future can be accessed or manipulated, but only to a limited extent. And what I came up with was, if the universe is a massively parallel supercomputer, in parallel processing, there is a rule called the never wait rule, which says that if your block of processing finishes its task before another block, you don't stop. Even if you don't know what, something that you need to know, you make an assumption about what the other block is going to come up with, and you keep going, because you can always snap back and use what you've done. But you may improve the performance of the machine. You don't just sit there not processing. Because you're waiting on another block of processing power.
Take a shot in the dark and see, maybe you speed it up.
Yeah, and maybe it's wrong. And so, so it occurred to me that if the universe is a massively parallel computer, then there might be all of these predictive assessments that have been done by blocks that got through their processing earlier, and so they kept going. And so their assessment is available in real time to a supernatural type access from another block that has not gotten as far in its processing. So some of these blocks would be things that will actually happen. Some will be approximations that had to be discarded because something else invalidated them. And so you would have this mix of access to past and future elements that resembles what we seem to see in some of the spiritualist type stuff. But
that just ripped my mind in half. Another one, just like the Titan. And you cool with I got 21 more minutes. You cool to wrap it up in 21 minutes? Beautiful. Another one is there was this author in like the 1800s or the 1900s, and it's a story about Baron Trump, the current president's son, for everyone listening after the post-apocalyptic thermonuclear war that is going to happen tomorrow, or at least by the end of this decade with China. At the current times, 45th president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, his son Baron Trump. But there's a story, you can look it up, it's actually really interesting, because an example they use is the wreck of the Titan. And the Titan, that was a story before the Titanic, for everyone listening, that kind of predicted the sinking of the Titanic.
It had an amazing resemblance.
Amazing. Well, that's what this. I'll need to send it to you. But it's like the adventures of like Baron Trump or something. And the thing is a lot of it's like eerily similar, but it's like, okay, you could maybe see, like, you know, make some assumptions. Maybe you're fudging the math a little bit, but it gets weird because this story, written in like the late 1800s, talks about how his father is a billionaire and becomes the president, becomes the 45th president, becomes the last president, and at the end of his first term, right before the next election, which it has on this coming election's date, the election is postponed because of riots near his dad's home on 5th Avenue. I remember hearing the story back in 2016, and it was already crazy. But now with the riots, it's like, holy fucking shit. So hopefully that will be one of the futures that was invalidated by another block of processing somewhere. Hopefully,
but
it's getting a little eerie, and it's and like there's like one illustration in the whole book, and it's like of Baron Trump, and he's got this weird little like Rubik's Cube type thing. And there's a picture of like the actual Baron Trump like walking out of Air Force One with like a fidget spinner, but like from the angle that the picture's taken, it's like overlaid. It gets a little eerie. It gets really eerie. I'll have to find the name of it, and it's not obviously I'm not trying to make a political argument.
Yeah, if you find it, send it to me.
I will. It's weird because the thing that triggered my memory was they bring up the Crash of the Titan, and there's like a couple other ones throughout history that are eerily, to talk about it, but. But
the thing is, you see some things though that people prophesy that don't quite come out.
Yeah.
And so, but there's enough there that it's hard to believe they didn't have some specific knowledge of this. But then why didn't it happen? So this was an idea that I had to try and account for that using the principle of, everything else I was working with, that the universe is a computer and it's a simulation.
I think
we didn't, nowadays it's cool to consider the simulation.
Now it's hip
theorem, but that was considered quite wacky back in the 80s. That virtual reality was something that you might actually want to move into and live in for the rest of your life. Now, of course, we've got a whole population of people that want to do exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like there's some there's some scientist quote that's like, it's like talking about like the Big Bang, and it's like the Big Bang, or maybe it was a theist. Yeah, it might have been a theist kind of shitting on scientists, but it's like the Big Bang is just the science community just saying, just give us one miracle. And it's like, well, no, you either get none or you get them all. So it's like, feels like you're explaining everything beautifully. I get it. The four main forces of the universe, the coalescing of protoplanetary disks, the creation of humanity, evolution, blah blah blah. But eventually you get far enough back, and it's like, well, what happened there? Well, there's a big explosion and everything came to be. Anyway, and it's like, well, what was that? Where'd that come from? It came from nothing. Why? Because. And it's like,
yeah.
Well, now you essentially just drawn it back to theism. You're going, there is this omniscient, omnipowerful force. I call it God, you call it the Big Bang. But I always thought that was a funny quote is the Big Bang is the science community saying of just give us this one miracle, all right? We're only asking for one, and then the rest of our story works. But it's what was it? It was the Big Bang. Why? Because, right?
Yeah. Earlier this year, what's the guy's first name? Wolfram. Do you remember A New Kind of Science? The Wolfram guy. His name is on the tip of my tongue.
Mm-mm.
I'm just trying to look it up here.
Roger Williams. I like that idea though. It's
Stephen Wolfram. Okay. While back, he wrote this book. He's one of these really super like online
Wolfram Alpha.
Yeah, Wolfram Alpha. Okay, so he wrote a book called A New Kind of Science, which was like that thick, about cellular automata, things like the game of life, and just going into like incredible detail about all of the wacky things that these automata could do if they operated by different, very, very simple rules, that they could create these massively complex structures that behaved in very unpredictable ways. And it was kind of interesting, but not really very relevant to anything. And earlier this year, he published an article saying that he had been working with a couple of his graduate students and that they had come up with a different type of cellular automaton that showed the promise of actually building structures that resembled our own universe. And he showed how this very simple algorithm being iterated over and over again, starting with a single point, would generate something that looks an awful lot like three-dimensional space. And then how, if you had a flaw in this space-like matrix, it could propagate in ways that resemble the way the particles move. It could interact with other particles in ways that resemble how forces work, and that it would exhibit both quantum mechanical and relativistic properties as it was able to produce these interactions. And I was extremely impressed with it because it answers that thing, of where did the origin of the universe come from? It started with one point.
Yeah.
And it uses these simple rules, and it's like, and unlike the cellular automata in his previous book, these are resulting in space-like and time-like interactions among particles that act kind of like real particles. And one of the things that he put in the speculative part is that we don't know what dark matter is. Mm-hmm. And he said one possibility, if his model is correct, is that things like electrons are actually very complex objects in this simulation, this automata realm. And there might be simpler ones, though. And they wouldn't interact by any force other than gravity. And there might have been a shitload of them created during the initial creation of the space-like matrix. And they might populate it at an even density, and they wouldn't do much of anything except gathering around gravitational wells like galaxies. And they wouldn't interact with anything. So what would they would resemble dark matter. Okay. And that this would be that, but there's no, this wouldn't correspond to anything in conventional physics. The thing about, it's like when my dad studied physics, it was just before the so-called standard model was codified. And so he's been doing some of these like video courses to catch up on things that he missed in his education. And he did a physics course, which I borrowed from him and watched. And it was all about the standard model. And so there's like three levels of particles that resemble one another, but they're like different masses, but all their other properties are the same. And then within these, there's, depending on which quarks make them up, they're positive charged or negatively charged or neutral. And it's just like, but there's like this whole zoo, and nothing about it looks fundamental as far as fundamental particles. So after I watched it, I was like, my reaction when we got to the leptons was just pull the other one. It was like, at this point, I no longer believe you're talking about anything fundamental. There's obviously another level below quarks that is necessary to explain how this works. And that's kind of where, when I read Wolfram's essay, I was like, this makes sense. This could actually, this is believable. I mean, it's that there are problems here and there with it, particularly with proving anything. But on the other hand, there were problems with proving anything when quantum mechanics was new. There were problems with proving anything when a lot of theories were new. Electromagnetic waves weren't known to exist until 40 or 50 years after the equations were, Maxwell wrote the equations that described them. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We discovered new things. I mean, when they detected the neutron star collision with LIGO, I remember reading that, and they were like, in an instant, this answered a question that had been standing for decades about where the heavy elements came from, because supernova don't make much of anything heavier than iron. So where does all the uranium and gold and platinum and shit like that come from? Well, they detect one anomalous gravitational wave thing, and they realize, wait, this is different. These aren't black holes. This is a signature that we would expect from neutron stars. But the difference between black holes and neutron stars is we can see neutron stars because they're not black holes. So they had two detectors running that detected this event, which means they could limit it to a circle around the sky. If they had had three, they could have reduced it to 2 points. But so they started looking for it. And when they found it, it was still in the early stages, and they could just see a shitload of these elemental lines, because you basically have two star-sized atomic nucleuses colliding with one another. And so they break up into parts that favor large parts. And then, so it's almost preferentially creating the heaviest elements. And it was with that one collision they did the math and realized this is an adequate explanation. We can explain where all of the heavy elements in the universe came from based on this sort of collision.
What would be weird is if we hit like the upper ceiling of that of elements that could be made by neutron star collisions, and then we still found other ones that were heavier, and like the only explanation would be that like civilization had to have formed somewhere and they made these synthetically. They're just signatures of civilizations.
Well, the thing is, the problem with the heavier elements than uranium is that they decay over a fairly short period of time. So we've made heavier elements. Some of them are relatively stable, but they're not stable over geological time. I remember one of the things that one of the startling moments was, I don't know if you had ever read the thing, they found an archaeological artifact that they think was a natural nuclear reactor.
The one in Africa.
Right. And you're going, well, how can that happen? Well, one of the ways that it happened was that the uranium in the Earth's crust has been decaying for 4 billion years, and this was 2 billion years ago. So at that time, the natural uranium in the Earth's crust was as enriched uranium for nuclear reactors is today, because it hadn't decayed as much. So that was why this natural structure was able to undergo fission.
What the fuck?
That had never occurred to me before, is that uranium has been decaying ever since the creation of the Earth at a regular rate. And back when this happened, it was richer. It was like all the uranium in the world was enriched by modern standards.
It was a dictator's wet dream. It was just go outside, pick up a rock, and you can kill the subhumans that you don't like, right?
Or at least you can generate lots of power to throw stuff at them.
Regardless, that's
it wasn't weapons grade, but it was good enough to make a reactor without a lot of work.
Regardless, ape cognition just going wild, just like yes. But that's always a weird thing to think about. Is because I remember reading some article, and I don't know if this is accurate at all, or if I'm just cherry picking from my memory, but I saw some model that said it was stable. They didn't, or not stable, but could physically exist. I don't know about half-life decay. I mean, it could be down to like nanoseconds, but would be up to element 5,000. Someone made, and I remember, if I remember correctly, I don't know why I'm just remembering. I could Google it, but my phone's recording the audio right now, so I can't. But someone said that it was theoretically possible. Would it ever happen? Probably not. Is there any reason for it to happen? No money incentive.
I know. I've seen suggestions of an island of stability in the mid-hundreds.
Yeah.
But even by that, they mean stable enough that you can observe it before it goes away in a flash.
Yeah. But on a long enough timeline, are we going to get to a place where, maybe something could have a half-life of like 10 Planck moments or something? But maybe the computers get big enough to where we can, like, imagine going,
Presumably, when you have a golf ball-sized chunk of a neutron star that's been blown off by a collision, that's what it is.
It's actually, that makes sense. Maybe that's just the element. It's just they just call it neutron. What is that? This is neutron.
Well, what happens is when you release it from the gravitational confinement,
of everything else,
then they naturally decay into protons and electrons to a certain extent.
Fuck.
So, So it's what happens is when you lose the gravitational confinement, you get these smaller chunks. Then the neutrons start to decay into protons and electrons. And the electrons fly off, but the protons repel one another and blow it into ever finer pieces until they end up the size, small enough that the strong atomic force can hold them together.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that makes it such a dramatic event is that neutron stars are stable because
they're so massive.
They're held together by gravity. But when you knock a couple of them together and the shock waves go through and blow chunks off, those chunks aren't held together by gravity anymore because they're not big enough. And then they quickly decay into more normal matter, which, an atomic nucleus of atomic weight, umpty billion, because it's the size of a golf ball, is not stable. So it disintegrates. And you end up finally, with everything disintegrating into finer and finer pieces because the neutrons are decaying into protons until the pieces are small enough for the strong atomic force to hold them together, and then they become normal elements.
What if that was, like, you get to an atom so big it is just the size of a golf ball?
Well, you would have that for a moment after a neutron star collision. That's basically the
frame
process they believe is
a frame.
You wouldn't want to be anywhere. You wouldn't want to be anywhere near it.
No, not at all. But hey, you don't want to be anywhere near uranium, right? It's a given. But yeah, for like one frame rate of reality, you might have that thing where it's just like a fucking atom the size of a watermelon.
Well, the existence in this frame of the neutron star and in the next frame of a cloud of normal matter flying apart, mostly made of heavy elements, implies this intermediate step.
Yeah.
Where there was a small enough chunk that the gravity wasn't holding it together.
Yeah.
And that implies this, I don't know how closely they've modeled that because it's kind of obvious. Once you get the chunk that isn't big enough for gravity to hold it together, it's going to end up as a cloud of heavy elements.
There's something in between. Maybe it's like sublimation where there is no in between. It just goes from one thing to another.
Well, I suspect what would happen is you would have a period of inertial confinement while the neutronium is being blown apart.
Yeah.
Probably preferentially around the perimeter where it's under relatively low pressure.
Yeah. But
you're going to have decaying in the center too, but it's going to take time for it to push that mass apart.
Yeah.
Because it's still neutronium.
Yeah.
Still a teaspoon weighs as much as Mount Everest.
Yeah.
So, but it's the outer core, it's the outer thing that's really going to be rocketing shit away as the relieved nuclei that are small enough fly off into space.
Have you ever? Oh fuck! I was about to say I can't find the book, but I realized this has been the stack of books that I've had the microphone on for the last 200 episodes. I was like, where is it? It's right here. Have you ever read this?
Yes.
Dude,
Oh,
yeah.
I've read the strip
The
since the
comics,
first one.
yeah, XKCD. But have you read his book, What If? I think you can find it for free online. Dude, it is fucking amazing. It is.
Let's see.
Actually, I just found the page that I was gonna. It's all questions. I don't think he's made strips out of all of them. It's but he put together all of his favorite questions that he's gotten from people. And one of them, the periodic wall of elements. What would happen if you made a periodic table out of cube-shaped bricks, where each brick was made of the corresponding element? And he goes in to explain it, and it's like the most horrific thing. Like, he explains exactly what would happen. He's like, for a moment in reality, it sits there all glistening beautifully. And he's like, T plus 1 nanosecond. He's like, it starts to get bad, and then there's like a ring of like a habitability around it that's like you know, or inhabitability that's growing and growing and growing to the point, and they start colliding and shit and chain react, and it turns into this debris would spread around the world, releasing thousands of. This is after 5 pages of explanation. Mm-hmm. The very end, the fallout wouldn't be everyday. Normal everyday radioactive fallout. It would be like if a nuclear bomb kept exploding. The debris would spread around the world, releasing thousands of times more radioactivity than the Chernobyl disaster. It would go on for centuries and centuries. But he just takes these questions. Like, I think the first one is what would happen if a pitcher threw a speedball at 99% the speed of light.
I remember that one.
You've read that one?
Make that one into a strip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just ends up, what happens is it just ends up leveling the city.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
But I also like that there. He said, like most things that involve relativistic events, this doesn't end well.
Yeah. Yeah. But he has all these. Fuck, I know I said we'd end, but I'm on a good tangent. Did you read the one that's like, what would happen if you had a mole of moles? Have you ever read that one? You know, like 6.02 times 10 to the 23 of like actual moles. Dude, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it ends up. I think it ends in like a thermonuclear reaction, but just like the build up is just like horrific. And then there's another one. It's what would happen if everyone in the world got together in Rhode Island and jumped at the same time? And he does like the calculation, and it's like nothing, you know. It pushes Earth like a trillionth of a nanometer. But then he goes on for like 10 pages describing what would happen if there are now 7 billion people here. He's like, well, no one's taking care of the nuclear power plants all over the world, so those start like breaking down. He goes, very quickly, there's too many people here. There's no bathroom, so, you know, there starts to be rampant sewage. He's like, in which case we have like rising like the bubonic plague. He goes, very quickly, the only people with guns form like warring warlord factions. And he goes into this whole thing. It has nothing to do with the physics. It's just the socio-political breakdown of what would happen. We start moving out west to try to get away from the core of people. So people start establishing like western frontier towns again. And just over the course of like a century, we eventually rehabilitate the rest of the world. But he breaks down into what would happen, and it's like a model of like geopolitical, like
I've read all of the online What If strips.
Yeah, okay.
I haven't seen the book, but I do have his Thing Explainer book.
Oh, yeah, I don't know, but no, I haven't read that.
That's the one where he explains things using the 1,000 most common English words.
That sounds brilliant.
The original strip was Upgoer 5. It was a cross-sectional diagram of the Saturn V rocket with everything labeled. But it was labeled using the 1,000 common words, and the word 1,000 is not one of them. So it's the 1,000 most common English words. And at the bottom of the rocket was an arrow pointing to the engine bells. This end goes down. If this end is pointing up, you are having a very bad day and will not go to space.
Yeah, isn't that, wasn't there something like that gave like when they built the shuttle, and they were transporting it on the 747. Do you remember that? How they'd move it?
Oh yeah.
On top, there's like
they had a special 747 whose whole purpose in life was to transport the space shuttle.
Yeah, hey, better than a bunch of fat Americans going to Hawaii. I mean, that's more noble of an existence. But it has like the one ball where the shuttle clips on, but one of the engineers or someone, they actually wrote in like huge, like foot tall, like letters. It just says orbiter goes here. But it's you clip in just in case there's any misunderstanding. Doesn't go beneath the plane, doesn't go in front of it, right here. But yeah, and someone was like, "Hey, leave it up to engineers to be assholes." But yeah.
Yeah, some engineering humor is pretty good.
Yeah,
that's a good example.
You need a. All right, well, obviously I can't tell the guests, but you know who I have to prepare for tomorrow. Mitzi's coming on again tomorrow, actually. Too beforehand. Yeah, I know you liked that episode. Isn't she badass?
Oh, very. Yes.
Yeah, Mitzi Perdue she's taking on cartels. She doesn't give a fuck.
I mean, that is badass.
Yeah.
I mean, these are people who will fuck up your shit if you're not very careful. So
not even your shit; they'll kill your family. They won't give you the easy out of death.
Nope.
And I love her explanation. I'm 78 years old. I don't care. It's just like
Because I've seen recurring ads for a T-shirt that says "Don't fuck with old people." The older we get, the less life in prison is a deterrent.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's like life in prison becomes less of a threat. It's just like diminishing. What is life in prison? Fuck. All right, yeah, I'll go wrap this one up. But you need to look it up right now. I'll send it to you. Mole of Moles. Which is, I laughed so hard reading that one.
Oh, I love his writing. Yeah, I mean, that strip is one of the highlights of my day when I see that they have a new one.
Dude, I should try to get Randall Monroe on here.
There you go. Send out an email.
Sometimes
I will. It works.
Sometimes, as you saw, how'd you get that guy? Well, funny thing is I just emailed them. Sometimes they say yes. Sometimes they don't respond. Sometimes they say, stop contacting me. And I'll be like, fine, all right, no means no, asshole. Like, all right, I get it, They're like, get out of my garden. Like, you're scaring my children. And I'm like, all right, sorry. Put down the megaphone, sir. But, yeah, you need to read that Mole of Moles, and then I'll find that, I'll find the tale of Baron Trump, or whatever it is. Just creepy. Yeah, it's creepy as fuck.
I'd like to see the...
You'll appreciate it, though. Yeah, it's eerie, but it's good.
The world is full of weird shit.
Yeah, which is, for everybody listening, go to the last episode with Roger. We go into the weird shit, but it's well, fuck, man. So, we down for next week?
Sure.
Fuck yeah. All right, my man.
And I'll have my own computer then, exactly like this one.
Beautiful.
I'll get my dad his on Halloween now.
Spooky.
It was delayed. Because of the hurricane.
Goddamn hurricanes. Oh, what was it? No, you know what? I'm not gonna shut up if we keep going. So I'm just gonna keep talking. Right. So, but yeah, Mole of Moles. Next week. Till next time. Roger Williams, author of the Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect, my favorite book, which will be in the top comment and in the description. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this podcast is next week, because in the last week I've gained more subscribers than I have in the last 3 months. From December until last week, I went from 0 to 5 to I think 630. From last week till today, I've gone to 882. So something's happening.
Yeah.
Something special's happening. I'm not sure what, but
hey,
I'll take it.
Sometimes it pays off.
Sometimes it pays off. I'll take it. All right, Roger. Stay safe, buddy. I'll see you next week. All right, my man.
All right.
All right, buddy. Take it easy.